St George's Hospital sits just outside the centre of Stafford, and if you pass the site today, it's easy to think of it as just another old building that's been cleaned up, converted, and folded quietly back into modern life. But behind these walls, there's over 200 years of history, and for a very long time, this was one of the most important, feared, and misunderstood institutions anywhere in Staffordshire. Before it became St George's Hospital, this place was known as the Stafford General Lunatic Asylum. Opened in 1818 during a period of when Britain was still trying to understand what mental illness actually was, how it should be treated, and what society was supposed to do with people whose conditions doctors could barely explain. Even the language itself tells you something about the era. Stafford General Lunatic Asylum. It sounds slightly brutal today, but that was the official terminology of the time. And throughout the old reports and newspaper articles connected to this place, the people inside were often referred to not as residents or even patients, but as inmates, which says a huge amount about how Victorian Britain viewed mental illness. Because institutions like this often existed somewhere between hospital, workhouse and prison. The building itself was designed by Joseph Potter, the same Staffordshire architect responsible for places like Newton's College in Lichfield. And from the outside, there's something almost elegant about it, with its Georgian symmetry, ordered brickwork and long rows of windows, making it resemble a country manor more than the sort of place most people imagine when they hear the word asylum. But that was partly intentional. Early 19th century asylum design was built around the belief that architecture itself could help restore the mind, and that calm surroundings, routine fresh air and orderly spaces formed part of the treatment, because psychiatry at the time was still in its infancy, and doctors were desperately trying to understand conditions they had very little knowledge of. At least that was the theory anyway. The reality inside could be very different. When the asylum first opened, it held a relatively small number of patients. But as the decades passed, the institution expanded again and again with extra wards, new blocks, and separate areas built for men and women until the site had become something enormous. Almost like a hidden town sitting on the edge of Stafford itself. By 1913, reports showed there were 865 inmates living inside the asylum on the 1st day of January alone, made up of 466 men and 399 women, while more than 1,100 people passed through the hospital's care and treatment system during the course of the year. And those figures matter because they stopped St George being just another old building and turned it back into what it really was. A place full of people. People with names, families and private struggles. Many of whom had been sent there because the outside world either could not help them, couldn't understand them, or simply just didn't know what else to do. And it's important to remember that many of the people inside places like this were not dangerous in the way that people often imagine. Some of the illnesses include depression, epilepsy or dementia, or even trauma, grief and learning disabilities, or illnesses that modern medicine would now treat very differently. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, if somebody was judged unable to cope outside, the asylum often became the answer. For some it may have been temporary, but for others it became the rest of their life. Inside the institution, daily life followed its own strict rhythm, with patients working in laundries, kitchens or even sewing rooms, while nurses and attendants managed the huge task of feeding, supervising and caring for hundreds upon hundreds of people every single day. At the time, this kind of labour was often viewed as therapeutic, because routine and work were believed to help stabilise the mind. Although looking back now, the line between treatment, discipline and unpaid labour often feels deeply uncomfortable. And while we naturally focus on the darker side of the asylum history today, the older reports also show that St George's was still a huge functioning institution, dealing with ordinary practical problems as well. In 1913, concerns were raised about the safety of the asylum's own water. Sourced from a well in its own ground, analysis showed that the quality had progressively deteriorated, with the supply described as unsuitable for drinking because of its extreme hardness, leading for plans for the hospital to be connected directly to Stafford Corporation's water supply instead. That detail might sound small, but it's actually important because it reminds you that this was not just a symbol, a ruin or the setting for ghost stories. It was a real working world. It needed clean water, repairs, staff accommodation, heating, kitchens and constant management. And around the same time, reports also mention a brand new nurses' home being constructed by a Hensford firm called Mason and Son, showing just how large the institution had become by the early 20th century. But behind all the statistics, committee reports and official language were individual people. and every now and again one of those people emerges from the records in a way that still feels painfully human more than a century later. One of those stories appeared in newspapers in 1899, after the death of a patient named William Southall. Now, Southall was just 40 years old and he came from Wolverhampton, and according to the report, he'd been admitted to the Stafford County Asylum only weeks before his death was investigated by the district coroner. The newspaper account itself is short, blunt, and strangely cold. It explains that on a Monday morning, Southall entered one of the asylum's retiring rooms, and while there, he managed to fasten his handkerchief to the handle of a door before taking his own life. The inquest returned a verdict of suicide while insane, with no blame attached to the asylum staff. And then the article simply moves on. That's what makes these old reports feel so unsettling today. A man's final moments, his illness and his fear, his whole life compressed into a few short paragraphs, and a legal verdict before disappearing quietly into history. Well, not today, Mr. Southall, because we remember you. There's very little emotion in the reporting and very little sympathy, and almost no attempt to understand what had actually brought him to that point mentally. But William Southall was not simply an inmate in an old newspaper clipping. He was a real person who entered Stafford County Asylum during one of the darkest periods of his life. Unfortunately, he never came back out alive. Stories like this remind you that behind the walls of St George's were thousands of private tragedies that barely left a trace behind. There would have been people admitted after breakdowns, women suffering after childbirth, elderly patients confused by dementia, or men destroyed by grief, drink or trauma, even families who genuinely believed they were doing the only thing available to them. That's part of the asylum history that often gets lost, not the architecture, not the corridors, but the patients. Because over nearly 2 centuries, thousands of lives passed through St George's Hospital, and most of those lives survive only as names in registers, as short fragments in casebooks, or as short newspaper reports written after something had gone terribly wrong. As the years passed, attitudes towards mental illness slowly began to change. And after the creation of the NHS in 1948, the institution officially became St George's Hospital. But although the name changed, much of the old asylum atmosphere still lingered inside the building itself. With long corridors, heavy doors, and entire sections separated from one another in ways that reflected an older system, built around containment and control as much as treatment. And interestingly, strange stories connected to the asylum didn't just begin after the building was abandoned, because I managed to find one newspaper report from the late 19th century. It describes what was referred to as considerable alarm amongst the nurses at Stafford County Asylum, after mysterious rappings began appearing at night on the windows of the nurses' sleeping quarters. According to the article, the noises had continued for a week or two, becoming so frequent that the matter was eventually reported to the asylum officials themselves, with male attendants and even policemen placed on special duty around the grounds in an attempt to discover what was causing the disturbances. But despite the extra patrols, the report states that no person or explanation could be found. The article even mentions claims of a ghostly figure and a hand appearing briefly before vanishing almost immediately, although it was specifically noted that the patients themselves were not believed to be responsible. Now, whether this was somebody playing tricks, nervous staff working exhausting shifts inside the Victorian Asylum, mass hysteria, or something genuinely unexplained, nobody ever seems to have discovered the answer. But stories like this show that St George's had already begun developing an eerie reputation. Urban explorers and modern paranormal investigations arrived decades later. And honestly, the real history of the place is unsettling enough without needing to exaggerate it. Because abandoned asylums almost create their own folklore naturally. Once the patients are gone and once the staff have left, once the records are boxed away and the buildings began to decay, the truth slowly starts mixing with rumours, speculation and imagination until the hospital becomes something different in people's minds. Not just a hospital anymore, but a haunted place. By the late 20th century, Britain's old asylum system was beginning to disappear altogether, with huge psychiatric hospitals increasingly seen as outdated and isolating, while treatment shifted towards smaller facilities and what became known as care in the community. Then in 1995, after nearly 180 years, St George's Hospital finally closed its doors. And after closure came perhaps the eeriest chapter of the building's history. The hospital building slowly fell into decay, with smashed windows, collapsing roofs, sections damaged by fire and nature gradually creeping back around the edges of the old asylum. For the people who entered during those abandoned years, the place must have felt frozen between two worlds. Not alive anymore and not fully gone either. The wards were empty and the corridors were silent, the rooms were stripped bare, but the structure of the place still carried the weight of what it had once been. Urban explorers describe St George's as unusually prison-like, with its enclosed spaces, long internal corridors, and the strange atmosphere of a building that had once hidden hundreds of vulnerable people away from public view. And even if you strip away the ghost story, every rumour and every exaggerated paranormal claim, there's still something deeply unsettling about that image. A place built to contain suffering, abandoned after nearly 2 centuries, left standing silently on the edge of Stafford. Now, St George's didn't remain abandoned forever. Eventually the buildings were redeveloped, the site was cleaned up and the former asylum became part of ordinary residential life once again. Today people live where patients once slept. Cars sit parked where nurses and attendants once crossed the grounds. And modern apartments now occupy spaces that were once part of Staffordshire's oldest psychiatric institutions. And maybe that contrast is the strangest part of the entire story. Because from the outside, redevelopment can make it feel as though the past has been tidied away along with the broken windows and damaged roofs. But places like St George's never truly lose their history. It still exists in the shape of the building, in the old reports and in the admission books. Even newspaper inquests, and in names like William Southall, whose story only survived because something tragic happened and the coroner had to officially record it. St George's is not just a story of an abandoned asylum, and it's not a simple ghost story either. It's a story of how Staffordshire and Britain more widely once dealt with mental illness. A story about medicine, misunderstanding and slow social change. It's about a building designed to look calm and orderly while holding people whose lives were often anything but calm or orderly. And it's about the thousands of ordinary people who passed through those doors, many of whom were not monstrous or dangerous, but vulnerable or frightened, or simply born in a period that did not yet have the understanding or treatment they truly needed. So when you look at St George's today, it's worth looking beyond the clean brickwork and the quiet modern streets, because beneath the surface is one of Staffordshire's most important mental health sites. A place that begun as the Stafford General Lunatic Asylum in 1818, became St George's Hospital under the NHS, closed in 1995, fell into ruin, gathered stories and then slowly became part of the modern town once again. And somewhere inside that long history are more lives than we'll ever properly know. People who entered through those doors frightened or misunderstood. The people that worked there, recovered there, or even died there. And for nearly 2 centuries, St George's stood as Stafford's hidden world beyond the walls.